you're right.
Welcome back, everybody, and I'd like to welcome Steve Kenny to the table. And I guess firstly, before you sit down, Steve, just congratulate you on the award that you just recently.
Thank you very much.
Well deserved. Too.
We're thrilled to bits. Kind of been lucky in picking up a few of those lately, which means we're possibly pointing in the right direction, which is good.
Get that acknowledgement.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Oh, I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillors, staff, we in September we had a little bit of a quick summary of the carbon forest situation. Since then, we have updated the regional emissions, and we've updated all of the metrics in terms of the where we're heading as a region. I have to say that the presentation I'm going to show you today doesn't include the latest forest cover results, simply because MPI and MFE haven't published that data, so we've had to adopt the earlier figures. There is a lag of up to 18, I may have mentioned this previously, a lag of up to 18 months on the publishing of data from those sources, which I have to say is a bit of a frustrating point. But, So what I want to do is just step you through the key findings from the research and the economic assessment, and also where we are today and what actions are necessary to be taken or should be considered by council following if you adopt the findings and ultimately want to implement change. So I think, as we probably appreciate, just simply in this process of carbon forest conversion of productive land to carbon forest has a very devastating impact on the region, and hopefully I'll be able to illustrate that in terms of the here and now, and also what the projected impacts are. The most significant impacts are population, loss of jobs, and decline in exports. But there is also a very important, significant fourth impact, and that is the amount of water that is reserved by forest that comes out of the system of water available for pastoral farming, for potable supplies, industrial processing, and emergency supplies. So that we did it back in the Venture Southland days. We did a regional water strategy, which kind of predicted pretty much what we've got right now. But what we found subsequently was that a number of the recommendations that came out of that work weren't adopted and haven't been adopted. So we have a really significant skew in the way we perceive, for example, available water, and that probably needs to be rectified. So, this is a hideous diagram. I'm not really wanting to say too much. The diagram that follows may help, but these are all the major sources of emissions from our baseline year of 2018 on the left-hand side, and the current 2022 report. So we've just published, since we spoke in September, we've published another update of the regional emissions. And in summary, when we consider the sequestration created by forestry and also the emissions, we've dropped our regional emissions by 14.8%. That is the most significant drop of regional emissions in the country, and I'll explain how that's come about. But in every area, in waste, in process industries, in stationary energy, and in agriculture, they have dropped. You'll see the green bar on the bottom, which is the offset created by forestry sequestration. That's remained constant simply because we don't have the updated figures. But in terms of gross emissions, that's the difference between where we were in 2018 and where we are today. We've reduced our emissions by 7.6%. And just to paint a picture of where we sit as a region, we produce, prior to this work really commencing in earnest, we produced 9.7% of all New Zealand's emissions as a region. which is natural given the productive nature of our economy and the export nature of the economy. There's nothing unusual about that, and carbon itself isn't actually a bad thing. It's a matter of keeping it in balance. So that's really the background. What does that look like? Well, on the left-hand side here, you'll see the purple bars, the gross emissions, and on the red or orange line through there shows the current forest impact on sequestration. So it kind of ebbs and flows a little bit. You need, depending on the export market and the amount of harvesting at any one time. But the major impact on forest planting at the moment is in fact the availability of seedlings and so on. There's no other limitation, it's just availability of stock, planting stock. On the right hand side is the net emissions, so that's the sequestration taken off the gross emissions, and you can see the trend line as it is. And you'll see that in 2020 there was a thing called COVID, and it really did impact us pretty heavily in that sense. So that's where we stand. But there's two major drivers of emissions reduction, and that is that as of today, 99 of our 187 fossil fuel boilers have been converted to renewable energy sources. That's either, these are consented boilers, not little boilers, these are big, more industrial boilers. 99 of the 187 have been converted, and we have another 60 that are on the pathway to conversion. They'll be converted by late 2025 or early 2026. And we have a very large number that our team are actually managing on behalf of the government and also past government, ECA, and that work will continue till the end of those contracts. So we're managing the conversion of 12 boilers at present, as well as the overall management of this boiler pathway. So in summary, we will have 158 of our regional boilers converted to renewable energy by the start of 2026. Now, to give you an idea, there's no other region in New Zealand that comes within a bull's roar of this, as to quote an agricultural phrase, and that is because we have such a export-centric economy. 70% of our GDP is in fact dedicated to exports. Export markets and access to high-value markets is relying very heavily on efficacy of production and removal of emissions within the process sector. The impacts of market access, high-value market access, and consumer preferences, and when I'm saying consumers here, I'm using a very broad sense of that word. So large corporates now require supply chain efficacy, and if you're a distributor of New Zealand's export products, you've got to see some action to create the high value opportunity into those markets. So what does this mean? And I'll just see on the screen, it's hard to see, but it means that since 2018, unfortunately, our sheep numbers have declined by 455,000 throughout the region. Our dairy cattle numbers are almost 45,000 decline. We have had a slight increase in beef numbers. What this means ultimately is that the emissions, biogenic methane emissions from stock has declined, as well as the boiler decarbonisation. And there's lots of other changes. In this last 12 months, we've had 75 businesses, as well as Southland District Council, go through the process of understanding how to create carbon baselines and develop abatement plans, so that all decisions, or most decisions that businesses are making now, have a lens around the life of the investment and other factors such as the emissions and the implications for the business. Our contracts now, a number of contracts we hold, Great South holds, requires us to be on a pathway to decarbonisation. So state sector agencies, receivers of funds from state sector agencies, large corporates, even oil industry-based corporates like Woodside, BHP, forestry companies, and large energy companies like Meridian, Contact Energy, and so on, require us to be on that pathway, or else we don't qualify for servicing those industries. So, what are the general figures? These are just the land areas that are impacted by dairying, non-dairy, and so on. So no great mystery there. We have over 800,000 hectares of our land that is classified as productive land, if you like. 730,000 hectares of that is highly productive land, but this map shows the productive land areas in its entirety, and the lighter green, I'll get to the point, the lighter green colours are the areas that are most suitable for forestry, and that can be downlands, high country below 500 metres in altitude, or just pastoral land. As we descend down that scale, and you can't see it terribly well, the slightly one tone of green darker is moderately versatile, and the darker green has some functionality as a forest for forestry, but the really dark green just doesn't cut the mustard. But unfortunately, when you take the really dark green out of that image, there's an awful large area of Southland productive land that could qualify for carbon forest, What we really wanted to understand was the triggers for making decisions around to convert what can be in many cases a highly productive piece of land. It's a complex decision making, so we dive deep and spoke to farmers and property owners and so on to understand this, and people contemplating these things. One really significant issue is the cost of the NZU, which is the tradable unit for carbon today, which is today $70.70, by the way, and has been up in the last 12 months, up as high as $85.50. So land above 15 degrees at $50 NZU is very appealing for forestry, particularly plantation forestry like Radiata, for example. However, when we get to $70, bearing in mind we're $70.70 today, land below 15 degrees slope, typically sheep and beef land, is up for conversion effectively. If a landowner chose to make the best financial decision for them as an individual, that would be a viable option, or very close to be viable. And there's other factors, of course. Constrained dairy lands, these are lands that are subject, that may be on high pugging index soils or not optimised soils for dairying, which are challenged by nutrient caps and water quality, then conversion of those lands would, in those lighter green colour areas, would be viable. But at $140 NZU, then average dairy, which is a 650 hectare dairy farm, 650 cow dairy farm in Southland, and there's 949 of those, or 900. So that is really significant potential impact. The other factors that are affecting the way people make decisions is, carbon price, we've covered that. Regulatory constraint, so nutrient caps and water quality is a really big issue for many farmers. And by and large, it's not that farmers are unwilling or not wanting to change mostly, is that the regulation has come out before the policy and the guidance and the training. And we would say that if there's anything that this new government should consider, is that you've got to get the sequence right. You can't just simply impose regulation and not provide the tools or the understanding of what to do and how to go about it. And we would be very strongly recommending a transitional approach to these activities. Not that we don't believe the environmental impacts and so on are important, but it's just you've got to work with people. Lifestyle factors are also a big factor, and that is that non-traditional succession factors, older age, colour and beyond, as the average age of farm ownership as it increases without succession options, then it becomes a choice, a viable choice perhaps for some. Physical impacts of climate, obviously, these will become more increasingly significant, and that is particularly inundation, the secondary flow through farm landscapes, and if you're in the coastal margins, increasingly sea level rise. But probably the major and most significant factor for many farmers creating really big challenges is that some farm systems are just founded on less than optimal soil types, and so you have to constantly be working to maximise your ability to produce on some of those lands, Just to illustrate this is the current position of dairy farms and consented dairy farms in Southland, as an example. Not picking on dairy farms, by the way, but unfortunately, when you look at the red soils, they're the beautiful soils for growing crops and horticulture and so on. They're not so good crops for large, heavy quadrupeds, So, and those mushroom shades and some of the purple soils are not the best of soils for dairying or intensive dairying. You've got to be very careful in those soils. So it makes it more challenging. It makes it more challenging when you're dealing with nutrient caps and these other promulgated regulatory change that's coming through. So in order to understand also why somebody would be motivated to make this choice, you've got to look at the economics. So we got inside the heads of quite a few people, and we created an economic model. So, for example, this hypothetical Southland farmer who might have 800 hectares of farmland and chose to put 300 in forestry, what would this look like in terms of return for that farmer? So, first of all, I'll explain how this works, but effectively, the cost of planting and management for that area of land would be in the order of $1.9 million over the growing cycle of the forest. The way in which the carbon credits, and we'll say it's a radiata forest. The way in which the tax credits or carbon credits are collected on this is called average accounting, and the maximum period for which you can take a tax credit or a carbon credit is in fact for 16 years. So even though the forest is in its very formative stage and not really sequestering carbon, the way the financial rules work is that for the first 16 years you can collect a carbon credit, and then harvest. In this case, this scenario, the carbon credits over that first 16 years would be $9.1 nominally $1 million of return. That's a direct payment to the farmer or the owner. The harvest then is in the order of $10 million of harvest income. Then you've got your net benefit there is $17.2 million, and of course that varies a little bit depending on the prevailing MPV discounting rate. But that's essentially the economics. Now, the kicker in this whole arrangement is that once you plant a carbon forest, once you've harvested, let's say in year 28, you then have to replant within 3 years, within 4 years actually, or else you have the carbon credits will be clawed back. So we become a caveat of interest on the land, but any subsequent forest activity on that land doesn't attract any carbon credits at all. So the big concern that we have had is that the investment profiles, foreign investment review processes haven't recognised that carbon, that plantation forest, when you're collecting carbon credit, is an on-ramp for permanent carbon forestry. So you have no choice in that matter, and it has very significant impacts for this region. So just in nominal terms, a lot of information on this graph, and it'll be summarised further into the report. But I think the big important piece is the 9.04 thousand jobs lost to our economy, and the major problem was there's the principles around economics that's called equilibrium economics. So the idea is you create capacity and that capacity gets filled. Unfortunately, in the Ojai nightcaps or the Takitimus or the Lumsdens, Five Rivers, Mossburns, Riversdale areas, there isn't a natural substitute for farming, for productive farming. The whole towns are set up through, for transport, for mercantile firms, for nutrient, you name it. And if you take that out of the economy, there isn't something that magically fills that gap. So we have not used an equilibrium model because we felt that this was a valid path to follow, and that has been validated by, we would argue, probably the best economists within the country. So the impacts for Southland are significant. I'll just quickly run through what the impacts of those loss of jobs is. That in Southland District Council, we feel that across the rural communities, we could be losing close to 6,000 population. And of course, each of the councils have a similar impact. Across the region, around 11,000 jobs, maybe 11,500 perhaps. But the big impact for our region, and we feel this may be a little understated, is that there'll be a cut of around $1.1 billion worth of exports. And if you kind of imagine that trend of stock numbers reduction and so on, and you think of the capacity we have in terms of freezing industry and dairy processing and others, it's pretty hard to see a clear pathway forward for those big export processors on declining stock availability. And apart from the obvious reduction in stock numbers this year in dairy, sheep and beef in particular, but sheep mostly, if you look at the scheduled decline, we are taking quite a commodity and schedule hit as a region, So this has a very sinister impact. We felt, having discussed this with Rob and Cameron and others, that we felt that this wouldn't resonate all that well nationally. So what? Southland's way down there, they've got a small population, they're not politically impactful or otherwise, but we feel that there's close to $100 billion worth of exports lost to New Zealand if you extrapolate the data out. So this is a very serious issue, and really it's been extremely frustrating to see that there hasn't been a policy setting promulgated from Wellington to aid councils to make better decisions, to look at the unintended consequences of these conversions, and to look at the tools that might be important. Just briefly on this, this is a really serious problem for Southland, and that is that there has been no consideration of the impacts of water the impacts of forest, impacts on water of forestry. What we have in the purple scale is the total allocated consented water takes within the region. Back in 2003 to 2006, when we set up the Southland Water Strategy, which was a collaborative effort which Venture Southland led, there were recommendations that we needed to progressively consider the allocations of water to forestry across with the passage of time. So as you can see from 2018 onwards, now there's an error in the data from Environment Southland at 2012, so I'm sorry, it steps from 2003 to 2018. But in that period, the allocated water, the water consumed by forestry has exceeded the allocated water by 2023. We see at the current rate of change that we will have allocations many times greater than the abstraction rates that farmers and dairy farmers and processors and industry and communities will take. And this water just doesn't magically appear back within the system. So it is very impactful for communities adjacent to large forestry or downstream of forestry activity. So we're urging Environment Southland to actually step up and really take into consideration these factors. Not so sure that we're being heard, but that's another story. So it's one thing to kind of point out the challenges. It's another thing to point out the solutions. So this is very small scale, sorry. We will circulate this presentation through the team. But we think there needs to be a urgent action. Now, as you all know, the principle of acquiescence is where you allow things to change and therefore you're deemed to have consented to that change by not acting, if you like. So the difficulty that we're facing right now, I'm not talking South New Zealand as a whole, but probably more impactful in Southland, is that once these conversions gain momentum, then it's pretty hard to then disestablish or regulate out of that setting, because individual property rights are deemed to be, this is impacting on property rights per se. So that becomes really tricky. We think that there's a national policy statement needed to be considered in this area, you know, and that national policy statement should consider carbon forestry in the context of the well-beings, you know, social, economic, environmental and cultural impacts within the regions. And there is precedent for this kind of action taken, but we do believe that councils need the tools to make decisions, and we do believe that forestry should be part of the district spatial planning process, should be recognised. I have to say, I should have said right at the outset, this is not a beat up on plantation forestry. It's a very important part of our regional economy. But when you move beyond plantation forestry per se into wholesale conversion of highly productive land, it's a different setting really. The other thing is that we need to look at redesigning the emissions trading scheme to opt out of collecting carbon units on productive land. You know, no problem on marginal land, no problem on riparian planting areas, no problem on wetland replanting or what have you. There's no issues whatsoever. We do have a concern that the inability to consider farm belts, shelter belts and so on is an arbitrary notional 30-metre wide planting that's ridiculous in this day and age. From Earth observation and satellite technology, we can get down to within you know, less than 10 centimetres of X, Y or Z elevation or northing or easting. So that's no longer an argument. We also think that the impacts of climate change and forestry need to be more aligned. It's almost like this policy promulgation has happened by somebody in a shoebox here and somebody in a shoebox here, and they never talk to each other. So we have to get more connected policy settings. It's not that the policies themselves in isolation are not all that well, no, a lot of them are bad, but we do need to really start to consider climate change, carbon, forestry, emissions in a more holistic manner. The other final points are that the Conservation Act, why is that significant in Southland? 58% of our total land area as a region is in fact conservation land and public estate. Currently there's no mechanism to allow native forest plantings within the conservation estate, and that seems to be a very significant omission in the legislation. Currently, one, because the Department of Conservation are not resourced to look after open land. They struggle with pest weed management and a whole range of other things. Whereas if we were allowed to plant within the conservation estate, would increase biodiversity, create less habitat for pest weeds, and would have a carbon unit. The argument that's been put to us, we've raised this with Minister of Conservation and others, is that the government don't want to take on the carbon liability. However, this is routinely dealt with in the private sector, and we believe that there's an insurance cover that can be provided for native forests, regenerating native forests within conservation estate areas. So, yeah, I guess really the freshwater availability is the other factor that seems to have been neglected in all of the discussions, and we feel we need to get with the program and really understand that. Where to from here? Well, when we have a government formed and we have an understanding of
tomorrow, I believe.
Well, that's great, yeah. But we won't know what the policy settings are going to be for some time, to be fair. But we would be urging council, if you feel so inclined, to really advocate strongly for this change. And if you look at the other attempts that have been taken by Local Government New Zealand and others, no disrespect to the people involved in the work that's been undertaken, but they probably haven't looked at the true fundamental drivers and some of the major effects, you know. And so I think the conversation, like with any new knowledge, conversations evolve and the urgency changes. So I feel that now is the time to advocate. This is at a very personal level, and it's entirely council's decision. But from our point of view, we've undertaken this work off our own bat as a regional development agency because we were really concerned about the long-term impacts of this in every in our communities, in our schools, our hospital, health services, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. I'm not sure if there's any questions you have, or you know, I'll attempt to answer. If I can't answer, I'll come back to you. But yeah,
I think so, Steve. Just a couple from me.
Yep.
Just reflecting on, just looking at my notes here. The permeability or permanentability, whatever the right word is, of the land change. Like at the moment, if you have a dairy farm and you want to revert back to sheep and beef, or revert back to sheep, you take down your dairy shed and you move it all, and you can kind of do it, or vice versa. But once you've gone onto forestry, you can't really go back. The damage to the land after, well, and can you actually go back when you're committed into the...
look, if you take the best and nearest perhaps example is the Ngaitahu lands in North Canterbury, and also the woodlot lands on the Canterbury Plains. When they were converted from, and this is only in the last 5, 6, 7 years, when they were converted, they found it really difficult to get a productive unit up and running, and the cost of actually removing the roots from the system and then reinstating the land was really, really challenging. So it's not impossible, but some species like eucalyptus, for example, they're gross feeders, so they draw a lot of nutrient out of the soils, you know, and so radiata has a very acid, deleterious material, and so changing the pH of the soils and drawing the nutrient out is a fairly potent combination, if you like. Yeah, so it's no. The quick answer is it's expensive, takes time, and it's just like reinstating mining operations. It take a very long time often to get back to where you were, you know.
So the changes from the NESPF to the NESCF, which I've had time to go through the detail of, is there anything positive in that towards some of the steps that you're recommending in those changes that have been made?
Well, to be perfectly honest, that hasn't been totally clearly articulated at this point. We think that it's one thing to have a setting; it's another thing to have the power to act. We feel that the power to act is the most important decision. In the absence of, say, regional councils recognising the water impacts and not using the water regulation that they have, that's a kind of a one-handed clap. It doesn't really work. You know, you've got to recognise it. You've got to factor it in. We can't see any quick regulatory change at this stage that's going to make a difference. And I mean a difference in the short term. It is urgently required, and probably that piece of advocacy through the zone meetings and with iwi and others would be a really positive way of getting this properly on the table for conversation, you know. Yeah.
I think it just highlights the need for that regional approach too, and everyone working together on this, because I've talked to people from Invercargill that it doesn't affect them, and that job loss slide that you had up there.
3,700 jobs.
There's a flow-on ripple effect of the whole thing.
You know, a lot of those jobs are high-value jobs too. We're talking lots of accountants. It's, in those figures, without getting down to a really granular level, there's a very significant impact on professional services and so on. They should be worried, actually. But more importantly, as soon as you remove people from communities, it's pretty hard to claw them back, you know. It's pretty hard. If for example, that hypothetical farmer, and I've heard this before, and this is fair enough, they've said, look, I'd be better to have my farm in pine trees and go to Arrowtown. You know, and I know one of Southland's leading farmers, I won't cite who that is, has said that. You know, I'd be better off planting my farm, go to Arrowtown. As soon as you go to Arrowtown, the money from carbon units doesn't even come back to the region. So you could kind of, the leakage as a consequence of either corporate ownership or absentee ownership is very, very impactful.
Pine cones don't go to school.
No, they don't. And you don't get a second GP in the rural practice if you've.
Looking at the quantum, some of what they were talking, 70, I think you said 85 billion of loss in exports. Like good exports to the year March 23 were only 70 billion.
Sorry? Yes.
Our goods exports as a country this year to March 23 were only 70 billion.
Yeah.
Add services, it goes over 100 billion, but
yes, this is
70.
Yeah.
If you're talking of a loss of 80 billion. I also, looking at this, it makes me think there's going to be other impacts of it in terms of forestry, fires. There's a fuel cake right there.
No, you're quite right.
We have had independent forestry services in here, and we've spoken to them about the impact on water. I believe, John, you've asked them about the impact of water. We've been told no impact, whereas yet here I see there's an impact. There is the fact that now the national policy statement on productive soils doesn't allow subdivisions, yet gobbling up productive soils here.
Yeah.
None of this really makes any sense.
No. Look, we could probably chat about this all day, but I would say that the highly productive soils, particularly in the hinterland of the of townships and so on, is really presents a big challenge for many communities, because the need to relocate to land above a certain elevation, adjacent or as close to, contiguous to services, is inevitably going to see some townships and
I see your modeling was, I think, up to $170, Steve, and the Environment Commission, the Climate Change Commission is predicting by 2025 NZU will be at $250.
that's correct.
When I look at that, I mean, our projections are not even there. What is coming, we are blind-eyed, blinkers on to what's coming.
We have had, we knew what the market entry offer was going to be projected out to 2035, but we see that changing quite quickly, and the new government has said that the NZU is going to be the primary instrument for decarbonisation, not Giddy Fund or other things. We would really urge them to look at that again, because the unintended consequences of uncontrolled NZU pricing will have a really significant impact.
And we are only the second country in the world after Kazakhstan that allows 100% offsets via forestry. So we are an outlier in the world there. And when I look at that, I could be wrong, it's either Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. I get confused between the two stands. But that sort of thing, you know,
Look,
what are we thinking of?
the point you're making is a valid point. We think there needs to be a decoupling between NZU
Yes.
and a forest unit. So that becomes a spatial issue. But hopefully common sense will prevail. But I from past history, I would say unless you're putting up solid arguments,
It's fairly short-sighted.
very rarely prevails.
Thinking that you can get income from it. You only get it for 16 years from the carbon credits.
That's right.
And then you're locked in to the replanting program, and whilst that was, forestry, your harvest was in there, you
Yes.
still got it out of that, you still got to commit to replanting again.
You do.
And as a country, New Zealand is actually going to be in trouble when they find out, because the thing about the conservation estates not being included was that because they're mature forests, they're considered to be carbon neutral. But the damage from that pests are doing doesn't make them carbon neutral. There's a whole layer of growth that's just missing.
No, that's right. That is correct.
So it was of concern if anybody comes in and does the study.
And on the back of the falling sheep and beef returns now and dairy returns, when you consider it's 250% increase in cost since 2021, the fact is we are the second kid off the block for farm freshwater plants, the Aparima catchment. When that comes in, it's going to amplify this because a whole lot of people won't be able to deal with it. That'll just be the final straw. The projections by Baker Ag, one of our leading agribusiness consultants in the country based in Masterton, are that over a 10-year period, an average sheep and beef farm, and they only tested four award-winning farms, average cost to them for over 10 years for farm environment freshwater plants is going to be $750,000.
And I think
So this is coming, and we are, since, after Waikato, we are the second one in the country, so this will amplify this.
it is a really big concern, and the thing is that farmers have said to us that we want to understand how to implement this change, and we need to get closer to our own decision making. Just as a region, again, not calling out individuals, but we only have about 7 independent farm consultants that would be considered integrators. So we have people that are really good at irrigation schemes, we have really good waste disposal systems, and some really good at waste ponds and so on. But for farm system integration, we have very few people, and many of the people that we do have are older age group, possibly one foot on a banana skin, the other in the grave. No, but the reality is that we haven't invested in the skills that are needed to help farmers through this process. So when you look at the best knowledge base that we have, it is the farmer. It's the farmer. It's whether it's a male farmer, female farmer, it doesn't matter. That's where the most knowledge resides. And the best thing you can do is work with people to help them to make good decisions. And we make no bones about the fact that we've looked at all of the emissions calculators, we've looked at all the farm management systems, 20 of them, emissions calculators, 21. To be honest, collectively, they're not worth the novel goat dirt. One, they're either too clunky or too difficult for the average farmer to use. And two, they don't bring all of the management into one place. So we've worked with the RDOT resolution team, Paul Ruddenclaw and the other, Henry, to develop a more complete set of data, so the average farmer, whether they're managing their feed budget or they're managing their stock management or their stock exclusion zone lands, that all of the stuff just becomes routine practice, and they have the ability to make their own decisions for the right reasons in the context of how this all changes. What sort of change is needed. Unless we do that, we've got a really serious problem. And so for us, our aim is to have 1,000 farmers in that system. We're beg, stealing and borrowing to try and do the work, but what we have done is looked at 37,000 hectares of productive land. The wonderful news is that there's actually awesome farmers doing some great stuff, and I'm not gilding the lily here, it's a fact, because everything we've done is measured and has a geospatial element, so you get evidence-based approach. Awesome work happening out and around Southland at the moment, but unfortunately there's a lot of really good work that isn't being measured. We had a great day, such and such planting in whatever location, and we went back to Fred's wool shed and we had a afternoon tea or a couple of bevies or whatever. But the most important thing for farmers is to ensure that any work that happens is measured. So we planted 10 hectares of whatever, natives or whatever it is. When it was planted, species and density, just simple calculation, and we're providing a tool at present to help that happen more routinely. If you've got a measurement and you can say, look, policy wonks in Wellington, as a region, our farmers have planted 10,000 hectares of new planting, carbon planting, you can start to have a more granular and nuanced conversation instead of having this dirty farming kind of narrative.
The difficulty is in getting heard, isn't it?
It is.
Because we've got a lot of farmers trying to make themselves heard about this and got evidence to support it, but it's not.
It's not all in one place, Councillor, there, and that's the difficulty is that Southlanders, Kiwis, we're not big on talking about what we've done. We're possibly more about just getting on and doing it. But this is one time that we do need to talk about what we've done and weave that into the provenance of production. Anyway,
That's great. Thank you very much.
We noticed yesterday, after going through Mokarita, all those hills planted and newly planted wine trees.
Yeah. No, we made the comment.
Yeah.
To Avery.
that's a rock road, all of these areas now.
It's a much worse environmental view in my mind than 50 turbines.
Oh, no question. Yeah. Because the impacts of 50 turbines are an economic impact initially, but greater certainty over energy availability. On the other hand, it's a gross loss, Yep.
No, thank you very much for that, Steve. Really appreciate you coming along and appreciate the work you put into that. So,
No, that's
appreciate it.
Steve, will you present this to the Regional Climate Change Working Group?
Yeah, we haven't actually been invited to that, so I'd love to think that we could be, but for some reason that's happening in isolation, which seems rather weird, considering we've probably had the longest enduring commitment to climate change and probably.
What you could do at the very least was this is live stream, so you could forward them the link to watch it.
Oh, this has been live stream.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
Steve, that decline in dairy cattle numbers, hasn't been that visible? Have we heard a few less or what? We haven't really lost many herds.
No, I think there have been some substantial losses, but mostly farmers are taking fairly, I would say, proactive action. What we're seeing is a decline in overall stock numbers, but actually production is still remaining quite high. And I think one of the things that many farmers have chosen to look at is their inputs versus their production. And many now consider bringing in supplementary feeds from overseas, no longer being the model. So possibly a decline in palm kernel use, which, you know, is a vector for environmental and disease risk. It's quite high, but, you know, that's a positive thing. And
If I may interrupt, when your co-ops are now going to be the scope 3 emissions, you now need to look at emissions intensity per kilogram of milk solid.
yes, yep,
You're again pushing them that way.
Yep.
Because these signals are coming that, all right, have less cows, feed them better, feed them more and get more out of them.
yes, that's right.
And we might actually be doing the exact opposite of what we need at this time.
Well, the heartening thing at present is that the processing arm of the major industries are really embracing the change, and they're making very substantial commitment. It is harder for farmers, but in many cases, a slight reduction in stock numbers is not affecting, anecdotally, and the feedback we've had, is not affecting their overall production. In fact, they've had a reduction in input costs in a variety of different ways. But that's feedback from farmers, yeah. So, yeah. But, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll share this information directly with the team, and as councillors, if you want to get a copy of the report, I'm sure it'll be circulated. Is that all right? Thank you.
I'll just close the day with that. Kia ora, kia marino, kia whakapapa, te namu, te moana, hei hurahi, ngā tātou, I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I, a tātou katoa, huiei, toa ki e. May peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day, let us show respect for each other, for one another, bind us all together. Thank you. It was a big day.
Just checking, if anybody wants to go for a tour through the stadium, I'm not offended if you don't. I'm just checking. No, all good. We'll do it another day.
Do it on a-
We can do it anytime.
Yeah, thank you.